millionaire sees a man and a child who are hiding a secret. A discovery in a stranger's diary changes everything. This investigation puts the past and future at stake. A relationship marked by betrayal reveals more than expected. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. The rising sun bathed the skyscrapers of New York City with a golden light, promising a perfect day. On the penthouse of one of the most luxurious buildings in the city, Emily Anderson observed the metropolis awakening, her eyes reflecting a mixture of anxiety and determination. Today was her wedding day, the day her parents, George and Helen Anderson, had meticulously planned since she was a child. Emily at 25 was the epitome of a young New York millionaire. Educated in the best schools, fluent in 5 languages, and heiress to a business empire, she seemed to have the world at her feet. However, as she absent-mindedly adjusted the fine silk of her robe, her thoughts were far from the lavish ceremony that awaited her. "Emily, darling, the makeup artists have arrived." Helen's voice echoed through the apartment, pulling the young woman from her reverie. With a resigned sigh, Emily moved away from the window. The reflection in the mirror showed a stunning woman, but her brown eyes betrayed a deep uneasiness. She forced a smile, knowing that her mother would tolerate nothing less than perfection on this day. Helen entered the room, impeccable in her Chanel suit. "Ah, my daughter, today is the most important day of your life. Richard is an excellent match, you'll see. The merger between our companies will be historic." Emily nodded mechanically, allowing the professionals to begin preparing her. As brushes danced across her face, she allowed herself to think about Richard Moore, her fiancé. He was indeed a remarkable man, intelligent, upright, and visionary in business. In the last 2 years of dating, he had proven attentive and caring, always respecting her space. However, something was missing. That spark, that overwhelming passion that Emily had always dreamed of feeling. It simply wasn't there. "Mom," Emily began hesitantly, "do you think I'm doing the right thing?" Helen paused, her gaze hardening for a moment. "Emily, we've already talked about this. Richard is perfect for you and for the family. He understands our world, our responsibilities. There's no room for doubts now." The young bride swallowed hard, feeling the weight of expectations on her shoulders. Since childhood, she had been raised for this moment, for this role. The perfect heiress, the perfect wife, the perfect continuation of the Anderson legacy. The following hours passed in a blur of frantic preparations. Dress, jewelry, final touches on makeup. The hotel's presidential suite transformed into a whirlwind of activity, with bridesmaids, family members, and event organizers constantly coming and going. It was amid this controlled chaos that Olivia, Emily's best friend and maid of honor, approached with a worried expression. This arrived for you," whispered Olivia, discreetly handing her a simple white envelope. The messenger said it was urgent. Emily frowned, intrigued. Careful not to draw her mother's attention, who was discussing floral arrangements on the other side of the room, she opened the envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained a typed message. "Dear Emily, before you take the most important step of your life, there are truths about Richard that you need to know. Not everything is as it seems. For everyone's sake, meet me in the hotel's back garden in 15 minutes. A friend." Emily's heart raced. Who could have sent that? And what truths could these be? For a moment she considered ignoring the message, discarding it as a tasteless joke. But something in the formality of the letter, in the veiled urgency between the lines, made her hesitate. "Olivia," she called softly, "I need your help. Cover for me for a few minutes." Her friend nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation without needing explanations. With an excuse about a problem with the veil, Olivia managed to create a distraction, allowing Emily to discreetly escape from the suite. The bride's heart was pounding frantically as she snuck through the hotel corridors, avoiding the guests who were already starting to arrive. The back garden was an oasis of tranquility compared to the buzz of the halls. Emily looked around, her eyes scanning every shadow, every bush. "Miss Anderson," a soft voice startled her. Turning around, Emily found herself face to face with a middle-aged woman, dressed discreetly but elegantly. Her eyes conveyed a mixture of compassion and determination. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice barely disguising her nervousness. "My name isn't important," the woman replied. What matters is what I have to show you." With trembling hands, she extended a folder to Emily. "In here is the truth about the man you're about to marry, about his family, about the empire you believe you're building." Emily hesitated for a moment before taking the folder. As she opened it, her eyes widened. Documents, photos, bank records. A complex web of information that, at first glance, painted a very different picture from what she knew. This can't be true," she murmured, feeling her legs weaken. "Unfortunately, it is," the woman replied softly. "I know it's a lot to absorb right now, but you needed to know. The decision of what to do with this information is yours, Miss Anderson. But remember, once you say I do, there's no turning back." With those words, the mysterious messenger quickly walked away, leaving Emily alone with her swirling thoughts and a folder that threatened to crumble everything she believed to be true. The distant sound of the hotel chapel bell brought her back to reality. The ceremony was about to begin. With a heavy heart and a conflicted mind, Emily knew she had a crucial decision to make, a decision that would change not only her destiny, but that of everyone around her. With faltering steps, she headed back to the hotel, the folder firmly clutched to her chest, as if it were a shield against the uncertain future that awaited her. The clock in the church tower chimed, announcing that the ceremony should begin. Inside the bridal suite, chaos ensued when they realized Emily had disappeared. Helen Anderson, her face pale with worry, tried to maintain her composure in front of the guests who were beginning to murmur. "Where is my daughter?" she whispered furiously to Olivia, who was trying to disguise her own nervousness. I don't know, Mrs. Anderson. She said she needed a moment alone," Olivia replied, feeling the weight of the lie. Meanwhile, in the back corridor of the hotel, Emily was running, her wedding dress dragging on the marble floor. The folder with the documents was firmly clutched to her chest, like a talisman. Her heart was beating frantically, not just from the physical exertion, but from the magnitude of the decision she had just made. She reached the parking lot and, in a moment of panic, realized she had nowhere to go. It was then that she spotted Frank, the family's trusted driver for years. "Frank," she called, breathless. "Please, I need your help." The middle-aged man looked at her with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Miss Emily? What's going on?" "I can't explain now," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But I need to get out of here, now." Frank hesitated for a moment, but something in Emily's desperate look convinced him. He opened the car door, and within seconds, they were leaving the hotel behind. Inside the church, Richard Moore waited at the altar, his confident smile beginning to falter as the minutes passed. Next to him, his best friend and best man, Alex, cast worried glances towards the church entrance. "Something's wrong," Alex murmured. Before Richard could respond, George Anderson, Emily's father, hurriedly entered the church, his normally impassive face now marked by anguish. He approached Richard and whispered something in his ear. The groom's face visibly paled. With faltering steps, he descended from the altar and headed to the sacristy, followed closely by Alex and George. She ran away?" Richard's voice was just a hoarse whisper. George nodded gravely. "Helen is trying to locate her, but she simply disappeared." Richard leaned against the wall, feeling as if the ground had been pulled out from under his feet. "But why? Everything was fine. We had plans." Alex placed a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. "We'll find her, Richard. There must be an explanation." Meanwhile, in the car with Frank, Emily finally allowed the tears to flow freely. Years of expectations, of carefully constructed dreams, were crumbling around her. "Where to, miss?" Frank asked gently, looking through the rearview mirror. Emily hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know. Just away from here." Frank nodded, understanding. "I know a place where you can stay for a while to think. It's a discreet inn in the mountains. The owner is an old friend of mine and won't ask questions." Emily agreed silently, grateful for the driver's kindness. As the car left the city behind, she opened the folder again, forcing herself to face the truths that had turned her world upside down. The documents revealed a complex web of shady business, involving not only Richard's family, but her own as well. Dubious contracts, stock manipulation, and what appeared to be an elaborate scheme to absorb smaller companies. At the center of it all, one name stood out: Victoria Carpenter, a powerful and apparently unscrupulous businesswoman. As the road wound through the mountains, Emily felt as if she were leaving behind not just her wedding, but her entire life as she knew it. The guilt of abandoning Richard without explanation weighed on her heart, but the feeling of having escaped something much bigger propelled her forward. Back in New York, chaos had ensued. Helen Anderson, with her usual efficiency, quickly transformed the bridal suite into an operations center. Phones rang incessantly, people came and went with information. "How could this happen?" George vociferated, pacing back and forth. "Our daughter wouldn't do this. Someone must have forced her." Helen, maintaining a surprising calm, replied, "We'll find her, George. And when we do, we'll understand what happened." In another corner of the hotel, Richard sat in silence, staring fixedly at a point on the wall. Alex remained by his side, offering a silent presence of support. "I should have noticed," Richard finally murmured. "She was different in the last few weeks, more distant. I thought it was just wedding nerves, but—" Alex frowned. "Richard, you can't blame yourself. No one saw this coming." "No," said Richard, a new determination arising in his eyes. "But I'm going to find out what happened, and I'm going to bring her back." As night fell over New York, news of the failed wedding began to spread. Journalists crowded at the hotel entrance, eager for any information about the scandal involving two of the city's most prominent families. In her luxurious office, overlooking the illuminated city, Victoria Carpenter observed the commotion with an enigmatic smile. Her phone rang and she answered in a soft voice. "Yes, it's done. The main piece is in motion. Now let's see how the rest of the board adjusts." She hung up the phone and poured herself a glass of champagne, silently toasting the view. The game had only just begun, and Victoria was determined to be the ultimate winner. At the Mountain Inn, Emily settled into a simple but cozy room. Looking out the window into the darkness of the night, she wondered what the future held. One thing was certain: there was no going back. The path ahead was unknown and frightening, but for the first time in her life, Emily felt she was making her own decisions. With a deep sigh, she took out her phone and turned it off. The world she knew would have to wait. Now it was time to discover who Emily Anderson really was, away from the expectations and plans of others. The night advanced, and in different corners of New York and beyond, the characters in this drama prepared for a new dawn. A dawn that would bring with it revelations, searches, and the unfolding of a mystery that threatened to shake the foundations of New York's high society. The dawn at the Mountain Inn brought with it a sense of unreality for Emily. For a brief moment, upon opening her eyes, she expected to find herself in her luxurious room in New York. Reality, however, soon made itself present. The simple room, the smell of forest, and the weight of yesterday's events. Sitting up in bed, Emily took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. The turned-off cell phone on the bedside table seemed to be calling her, but she resisted the temptation. She wasn't ready to face the whirlwind that certainly awaited her. Meanwhile, in New York, the Anderson mansion was a center of frantic activity. Helen, with deep dark circles betraying a sleepless night, coordinated a team of private investigators. "I want every inch of this city searched," she ordered, her normally controlled voice now laden with emotion. "My daughter is somewhere, and we're going to find her." George, sitting in his favorite armchair, seemed to have aged years in a single night. "Helen," he began hesitantly, "don't you think we should consider the possibility that Emily ran away of her own free will?" The look Helen gave her husband could have frozen hell. "Our daughter wouldn't do this to us, George. Something or someone forced her into this." In the Moore penthouse, the scene wasn't much different. Richard, still dressed in his wrinkled wedding clothes, frantically examined his phone, rereading every message exchanged with Emily in recent weeks, looking for some clue he might have missed. Alex, who had spent the night with his friend, watched with concern. "Richard, you need to rest. You won't help Emily if you collapse." "Rest?" Richard laughed bitterly. "How can I rest when the woman I love has disappeared without a trace? Something's wrong here, Alex. Emily wouldn't do this without a very serious reason." At that moment, Richard's phone rang. It was an unknown number. With his heart racing, he answered. "Hello, Emily? Mr. Moore?" An unfamiliar female voice sounded on the other end. "This is Clara from the Bellevue Hotel reception. Miss Anderson left something here that we thought you might want to see." Richard exchanged a quick glance with Alex before responding. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Meanwhile, at the inn, Emily finally mustered the courage to turn her cell phone back on. The flood of notifications almost crashed the device. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of messages. Her eyes captured fragments. "Where are you? Please come back. We're worried." With trembling hands, she opened the folder of documents again. Among contracts and financial reports, a photo caught her attention. Her father, George, in a meeting with Victoria Carpenter and Richard's father. The date in the corner of the image was just 3 months ago. "What's going on here?" Emily murmured to herself. Determined to better understand the situation before making any contact, Emily went down for breakfast. The inn owner, a grey-haired lady named Mrs. Cecilia, greeted her with a gentle smile. "Good morning, dear. I hope you slept well. Frank told me you need some time to yourself, so don't worry." "Here you're safe." Emily smiled gratefully, feeling welcomed for the first time in a long time. "Thank you, Mrs. Cecilia. I really need some time to reorganize my thoughts." Meanwhile, at the Bellevue Hotel, Richard and Alex arrived at the reception. Clara, a young receptionist, greeted them with an envelope in hand. "Mr. Moore, we found this in the room where Miss Anderson got ready for the wedding," she explained, handing the envelope to Richard. With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "The truth isn't always what it seems. Sometimes those we love most are the ones who deceive us the most. Look for Victoria Carpenter." Richard turned pale. "Victoria Carpenter, the businesswoman?" Alex frowned. "What does she have to do with this?" Back at the inn, Emily decided to take a walk around the surroundings to clear her mind. The fresh mountain air and the sound of birds were a stark contrast to the bustle of New York. As she walked, she couldn't help but think of Richard. Despite everything, her heart ached imagining the pain she must have caused him. It was then that a familiar figure caught her attention. Standing near a tree, looking directly at her, was Frank, the driver. "Miss Emily," he said softly, approaching. "Forgive me for following you, but there's something I need to tell you, something about your family, and about Victoria Carpenter." Emily's heart raced. You know something, Frank?" The old driver nodded gravely. "I know more than I'd like to, miss, and I believe the time has come to share this burden." Meanwhile, in her office in New York, Victoria Carpenter received an unexpected visit. Helen Anderson entered, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Where is my daughter, Victoria?" Helen demanded without beating around the bush. Victoria smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Helen, darling, I have no idea what you're talking about. Why would I know where Emily is?" "Don't play with me," Helen hissed. "I know you're involved in this somehow, and I'm going to find out how." Victoria stood up, her posture exuding confidence. "Be careful with your accusations, Helen. Remember, we all have secrets we prefer to keep buried." The air between the two powerful women was charged with tension. Both knew they were on the edge of a precipice, and that the next move could change everything. Back in the mountains, Emily and Frank sat on a wooden bench, the bucolic scenery in contrast to the gravity of the conversation they were about to have. "Miss," Frank began, his voice laden with emotion, "what I'm about to tell you will change your perception of everything and everyone around you. Are you ready for this?" Emily hesitated for a moment, aware that she was about to cross a point of no return. Then, with determination in her eyes, she nodded. "I'm ready, Frank. Please tell me everything." As Frank began his narrative, the sun reached its highest point in the sky. In different parts of New York and beyond, the characters in this complex plot were moving, each following their own agenda, unaware that their actions were about to collide in a spectacular manner. The truth, long hidden, was about to come to light, and with it the potential to destroy lives, reputations, and fortunes. But for Emily, sitting on that wooden bench in the mountains, far from the world she had always known, it was the beginning of a journey of self-discovery and redemption. The birdsong in the mountains seemed distant to Emily as she absorbed Frank's words. The old driver, with teary eyes, unraveled a story that seemed straight out of a suspense film. "It all started 20 years ago," Frank began, his voice heavy with regret. "Your father and Victoria Carpenter were partners in a promising venture. But Victoria, she always wanted more. She orchestrated a scheme to push your father aside and take full control." Emily felt a knot form in her throat. "But my father, he's such an honest man." Frank shook his head sadly. He was, miss. But Victoria had compromising information about him. About all of them. Your father, Richard's father, even your mother. She kept them under control for years, manipulating them like pieces on a chessboard. Meanwhile, in New York, Richard and Alex frantically searched Victoria Carpenter's office. Taking advantage of a family connection, they had gained access to the building outside business hours. There must be something here, Richard muttered, rummaging through drawers. Some clue about Emily's whereabouts or the reason for her escape. Alex, fiddling with the computer, let out a surprised exclamation. "Richard, come see this." On the screen, a series of emails exchanged between Victoria and an anonymous recipient revealed elaborate plans to manipulate stock market shares, divert funds, and sabotage the Anderson-Moore wedding. What the hell is going on here? Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. Back in the mountains, Emily struggled to process the information Frank was providing her. "But why the wedding? Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Frank sighed deeply. "The wedding, miss, was the final piece of Victoria's plan. Uniting the Anderson and Moore families would create too powerful a conglomerate. She couldn't allow that. And the letter? The one I received on the wedding day. It was I who delivered it," Frank admitted, lowering his eyes, "at the request of someone who wants to see Victoria exposed. Someone from inside her circle." At the Anderson mansion, Helen confronted her husband in a heated discussion. "How could you hide this from me, George?" she shouted, holding a dossier she had just discovered in his office. "Years of shady business, manipulation, blackmail, all of this under our roof." George, looking defeated, sank into his armchair. "I had no choice, Helen. Victoria, she knows things that can destroy not just me, but all of us." Helen, with tears of anger in her eyes, threw the dossier on the table. "And now our daughter is missing. All because of your dirty secrets." In Victoria's office, Richard and Alex continued their frantic search for information. It was then that they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. "Someone's coming," Alex whispered in panic. Quickly, they hid behind a heavy curtain. The door opened and Victoria Carpenter's unmistakable voice filled the room. "Yes, everything is going according to plan," she spoke on the phone. "Emily ran away. The families are in chaos. It's time to move on to the next phase." Richard had to restrain himself from jumping out of his hiding place. Alex held his arm tightly, silently begging for caution. In the mountains, Emily was making a difficult decision. "I need to go back, Frank. Face this head on." The old driver nodded with respect. "I understand, miss, but allow me to advise you. Don't trust anyone completely. Not even your family." With a heavy heart, Emily began to pack her things. As she folded a blouse, a small object fell from her purse. A flash drive. She picked it up, frowning in confusion. She didn't remember putting it there. Curious, she connected it to her laptop. What she saw left her speechless. They were copies of all the incriminating documents Victoria possessed. Emails, contracts, compromising photos. Everything was there. "My God," whispered Emily. "This changes everything." In New York, Victoria finally left her office. Richard and Alex emerged from their hiding place, their minds spinning with the information they had obtained. "We have to find Emily," said Richard, determination in his voice. "Now more than ever." Alex nodded, but his look was one of concern. "And then? What will we do with everything we've discovered?" Richard paused for a moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "First, we find Emily. Then we expose everything, no matter who gets hit." At the Anderson mansion, the phone rang, breaking the tense silence between Helen and George. Helen answered, her voice trembling. "Hello? Mom?" Emily's voice sounded on the other end. "I'm coming home. We have a lot to talk about." Helen felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "Emily, my love, where are you?" "We're so worried." "I'll be home in a few hours," Emily replied, her voice firm. "And Mom, prepare yourself. Things are going to change drastically when I arrive." As the sun began to set over New York, the various characters in this complex plot were moving, each with their own revelations and secrets. Emily, driving back to the city with Frank, carried with her not only a flash drive full of secrets, but also the weight of decisions that would change the course of many lives. Richard and Alex were leaving Victoria's building, determined to unravel the mystery and protect those they loved. And in the shadows, Victoria Carpenter was making her own machinations, unaware that her elaborate house of cards was about to crumble. Night was falling over New York when Frank's car finally entered the gates of the Anderson mansion. Emily, her heart racing, clutched the flash drive in her hand as if it were a talisman. She knew that by crossing the threshold of that door, nothing would ever be the same again. Helen and George anxiously awaited in the living room, the tension palpable in the air. When Emily entered, there was a moment of deafening silence before Helen rushed to embrace her daughter. "My God, Emily, never do that to us again," exclaimed Helen, tears streaming down her face. Emily briefly returned the hug, but soon pulled away, her eyes fixed on George. "Dad, we have a lot to talk about." George, noticing the seriousness in his daughter's gaze, nodded gravely. "Yes, we do." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Richard and Alex arrived at the Moore penthouse. Richard was about to enter when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" he answered hesitantly. "Mr. Moore," a female voice spoke on the other end. "This is Olivia, Emily's best friend. She's back. She's at the Anderson mansion now." Richard felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "Thank you, Olivia. I'm heading there now." At the Anderson mansion, Emily led her family to the library, a place she had always considered safe for important conversations. Frank followed them at Emily's request. "Before we begin," said Emily, her voice trembling slightly, "I want you to know that I've discovered things that change everything." She inserted the flash drive into the library computer, and soon the screen filled with documents, emails, and photos. Helen gasped, bringing her hands to her mouth. George visibly paled. Where did you get this?" asked George, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked at Frank, who nodded encouragingly. "That doesn't matter now, Dad. What matters is the content. Victoria Carpenter, the shady businesses, the manipulation. I know everything." In Victoria Carpenter's office, the businesswoman received an alarming call. "What do you mean the flash drive is missing?" she vociferated on the phone. "That information can't fall into the wrong hands. Find it, whatever it takes." Back at the Anderson mansion, the discussion intensified. Helen, recovering from the initial shock, turned to her husband with fury in her eyes. "How could you, George? How could you put our family at risk like this?" George, looking years older, sank into an armchair. I had no choice. Victoria had information that could destroy us. She threatened to expose everything if I didn't cooperate." Emily, feeling a mixture of anger and compassion, approached her father. "What information, Dad? What could be so terrible as to justify years of submission to a woman like Victoria?" Before George could answer, the mansion's doorbell rang. Moments later, Richard burst into the library, followed by a breathless Alex. "Emily!" exclaimed Richard, his eyes shining with relief and love. He made a move to embrace her, but stopped when he noticed the tension in the room. What's going on here?" Emily, with tears in her eyes, turned to Richard. "Richard, I'm sorry for running away, but there are things you need to know. About your family, about mine, about everything." Richard, noticing the documents on the computer screen, frowned. "We discovered things too, Emily. About Victoria Carpenter and her involvement in all this." For a moment, silence reigned in the library. Each person present carried a piece of the puzzle, and now it was time to put all the pieces together. George, seeming to have made a decision, slowly stood up. "It's time for the truth. You all deserve to know." He walked to a bookshelf and, to everyone's surprise, activated a hidden mechanism. A secret passage opened, revealing a safe built into the wall. "Dad?" Emily whispered, confused. George entered a combination and opened the safe, removing an old and dusty folder from it. "This is the real reason why Victoria had power over us all these years. It's time to face our demons." As George prepared to reveal the contents of the folder, Richard's phone rang again. It was his father. "Son," Mr. Moore's voice sounded urgent, "don't trust anyone. I'm on my way to the Anderson mansion. There are things you need to know about Victoria and about the past of our families." The tension in the library was palpable. Secrets buried for decades were about to come to light, threatening to forever change the fate of all present. Outside the mansion, a car parked silently. Victoria Carpenter stepped out of it, determination in her eyes. She knew her empire of secrets was threatened, and she was willing to do anything to keep it intact. The night had barely begun, and it already promised to be one of the longest and most revealing in the history of the Anderson and Moore families. The long-hidden truths were about to be exposed, and no one would emerge unscathed from this revelation. The air in the Anderson mansion's library was heavy with tension as George slowly opened the dusty folder. All eyes were fixed on him, waiting for the revelations that promised to change everything. 30 years ago, George began, his voice trembling. Our families weren't what they are today. We were ambitious, yes, but we didn't have the power or influence we have now. He removed an old photo from the folder, showing it to everyone. In it, young versions of George, Richard's father, and Victoria Carpenter smiled at the camera, embracing like old friends. We were inseparable, he continued. 3 young entrepreneurs with dreams too big for our empty pockets. That's when we met Charles Miller. Richard frowned. Charles Miller? The magnate who mysteriously disappeared decades ago. George nodded gravely. The very one. Charles saw potential in us and decided to finance us, but he was a complicated man. His methods weren't always ethical. Emily, feeling they were getting to the heart of the matter, pressed, "What happened, Dad?" George closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. Charles started involving us in increasingly shady businesses, money laundering, bribes, even blackmail. At first we convinced ourselves it was necessary, that the end justified the means. Helen, who had been listening to everything in silence, let out a muffled sob. She knew part of the story, but never its entirety. One night, George continued, there was a heated argument between Charles and Victoria. She wanted more power, more control. Things got out of hand. At that moment, the library door abruptly opened. Richard's father entered, breathless and with a pale face. "George," he said, "we can't continue with this lie. It's time to tell the whole truth." Richard, confused and increasingly alarmed, looked from his father to George. "What truth? What's going on?" Richard's father approached, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "That night, Charles Miller didn't disappear. He died," a cold voice completed from the door. Everyone turned to see Victoria Carpenter standing there, her eyes glowing with a mixture of fury and triumph. And we were all there. A sepulchral silence fell over the room. Emily felt her legs weaken, and Richard instinctively supported her. Victoria entered the library, her heels echoing on the wooden floor. "Oh, don't look at me like that. You all benefited from what happened that night. Your fortunes, your power, everything has its origin in that moment." "It was an accident," Richard's father murmured, more to himself than to the others. "It was necessary," Victoria retorted coldly. "Charles was going to betray us, expose everything. I did what I had to do to protect us." George, seeming to age years in minutes, turned to Emily and Richard. "That's why Victoria had power over us all these years. She threatened to expose our involvement if we didn't follow her orders." Emily, struggling to process everything, asked in a trembling voice, "And the wedding? Why was it so important to prevent it?" Victoria laughed, a humorless sound. "Oh, darling, your marriage to Richard would unite the two families, creating too powerful an empire. I couldn't allow that. You might discover the truth and challenge me." Richard, feeling a growing anger, stepped forward. "So everything, my whole life, my relationship with Emily, was manipulated by you." "Don't be naive," Victoria replied. "Your love may be real, but the circumstances that brought you together were carefully orchestrated. I needed to keep the families close, but not united." Helen, who had remained silent until then, suddenly stood up. "Enough. We can't continue living in this web of lies and manipulation. It's time to take responsibility for our actions." George nodded slowly. "Helen is right. We've lived with this weight for decades. Maybe it's time to face the consequences." Victoria, realizing she was losing control of the situation, pulled a small device from her purse. "You don't understand. I have enough evidence to destroy all of us. One click on this button and everything goes to the press, the police, everyone." It was at that moment that Frank, who had been observing everything in silence, stepped forward. "No, Victoria, it's over." To everyone's surprise, he pulled a badge from his pocket. "I'm a federal agent, infiltrated for years to investigate Charles Miller's disappearance and the subsequent corruption schemes." The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Victoria, for the first time, seemed genuinely shocked. Frank continued, "The flash drive that Emily has contains not only your evidence, Victoria, but also all the proof I've collected over the years. It's all over. Victoria, seeing her empire of lies crumble, made a move to flee, but Alex, who was near the door, stopped her. Emily, feeling the weight of everything she had discovered, turned to Richard. Their eyes met, full of pain, confusion, but also a love that, despite everything, remained intact. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard intertwined his fingers with hers. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we'll face it together." As Frank made calls to his superiors and Victoria was kept under surveillance, the Anderson and Moore families found themselves facing an uncertain future. Decades of secrets had been exposed, and the dawn would bring with it not only the threat of legal consequences, but also the challenge of rebuilding trust and relationships shattered by lies. The night advanced, and with it, the certainty that nothing would ever be the same. But amid the chaos and uncertainty, one thing was clear. The truth, however painful it might be, had finally come to light. And with it, the chance for a new beginning. Emily and Richard, hand in hand, faced an uncertain future, but for the first time, it was a future based on truth, however painful it might be. And at that moment, between chaos and uncertainty, there was a spark of hope. The hope that from the ashes of their past they could build something new, something genuine. The journey would be long and difficult, but at least now finally they could walk in the light of truth. In the weeks that followed the fateful night of revelations, New York buzzed with rumors and speculation. The Anderson and Moore names, once synonymous with success and prestige, were now whispered in corporate corridors with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Emily and Richard, seeking to escape the media whirlwind, had taken refuge in a discreet beach house on the coast of Long Island. It was a simple place, far from the luxury they were accustomed to, but it offered what they needed most at that moment: peace and privacy to process everything that had happened. On a sunny morning, Emily walked along the sand, her bare feet feeling the texture of the grains. Richard watched her from the veranda, a coffee in his hands, admiring how she seemed lighter, more authentic, away from the pressures and expectations of her previous life. "What are you thinking about?" he asked when she returned to the house. Emily smiled, a gesture that was becoming more frequent in recent days. "About how strange it is. My whole life was built around expectations, plans, and lies. And now, here I am, without any of that. And I feel more me." Richard nodded, understanding. "I know exactly what you mean. It's as if we're rediscovering ourselves." Meanwhile, in New York, the investigations continued. George and Richard's father were fully cooperating with the authorities, hoping for some leniency. Helen, in turn, channeled her energy into keeping what she could of Anderson Enterprises running, determined to save her family's legacy, this time ethically. Victoria Carpenter, confronted with the mountain of evidence against her, finally broke her defiant silence. In a series of testimonies, she revealed decades of manipulations, blackmail, and shady dealings that extended far beyond the Anderson and Moore families. On a particularly tense afternoon, Agent Frank, still strange for many not to call him Frank, called a meeting with Emily and Richard at the police station. "The case is expanding," he explained, his face showing signs of fatigue. "Victoria's revelations have opened a Pandora's box. We are unraveling a web of corruption that reaches the highest echelons of government and business." Emily felt a tightness in her chest. "And our parents?" Frank sighed. "They're not innocent, but their cooperation has been valuable. There's a possibility of plea bargains, which could significantly reduce their sentences." Richard, who had been silent, finally spoke. "And what about us? What's our role in all of this now?" The agent looked at the young couple with a mixture of compassion and respect. "You two are key pieces in this puzzle. Your stories, if told correctly, can help expose decades of corruption and perhaps initiate real change in the system." The idea was scary and at the same time liberating. Emily and Richard exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was a chance to transform all the pain and betrayal into something positive. Back at the beach house, they discussed at length what to do. The decision to publicly expose their stories wasn't easy, but they felt it was necessary. "It's our chance to make a difference," said Emily, determination shining in her eyes, "to use our platform for something bigger than ourselves." Richard agreed, pulling her into an embrace. Together, we can turn this tragedy into a catalyst for change. In the months that followed, Emily and Richard worked tirelessly with investigative journalists and authorities. Their stories, intertwined with Victoria's revelations and ongoing investigations, painted a vivid picture of how power and greed could corrupt even the most well-intentioned people. The impact was seismic. As more details came to light, a wave of indignation swept the country. Protests erupted, demanding reforms and greater transparency in the corporate and political world. Meanwhile, away from the spotlight, more personal transformations were occurring. Olivia, confronting her own demons, sought therapy to deal with the guilt and fear that had led her to betray her best friend's trust. Alex, in turn, dedicated himself to volunteer work, seeking redemption through service to others. Helen, surprising everyone, used her experience and connections to found an organization dedicated to promoting business ethics and supporting whistleblowers. It was her way of trying to make amends for the mistakes of the past. A year after the initial revelations, Emily and Richard were back in New York for a press conference. The goal was to announce the creation of a foundation dedicated to fighting corruption and promoting transparency in the public and private sectors. Before going on stage, Emily held Richard's hand, seeking strength. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. Richard smiled, that smile that always warmed her heart. "With you by my side, I'm ready for anything." In front of the cameras and reporters, the young couple was no longer just the heirs of empires built on lies. They were symbols of change, of redemption, of hope. Emily began her speech. "A year ago, our lives were turned upside down. We discovered that everything we believed we knew was based on lies and manipulations. But from those ashes, we found a deeper truth, that each of us has the power to choose a different path, to break cycles of corruption and build a more ethical and transparent future." Richard continued, "Our foundation is not just about exposing past mistakes. It's about creating a future where integrity is not the exception, but the rule, where young entrepreneurs and leaders can grow knowing that true success comes from honesty and hard work, not from schemes and manipulations." As they spoke, their words echoed not just in the press room but throughout the country. It was the beginning of a new era, not just for Emily and Richard, but for all those inspired by their journey of redemption and reconstruction. The road ahead was still long and full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, there was a genuine sense of hope, a hope that from the ashes of a corrupted past, a brighter and more honest future could emerge. And at the center of it all was a love that, tested by the fire of adversity, proved to be stronger and truer than anyone could have imagined. 2 years had passed since the press conference that marked the launch of the Anderson Moore Foundation for Ethics and Transparency. Time brought significant changes, not only for Emily and Richard, but for the entire business and political landscape of the United States. On a sunny Saturday morning, Emily woke to the soft sound of the sea. She and Richard had transformed the beach house, once a temporary refuge, into their permanent home. The simplicity and peace of the place contrasted drastically with the busy life they led in New York, and both felt that here they could truly be themselves. Richard entered the bedroom carrying a breakfast tray. "Good morning, love," he said, placing a soft kiss on Emily's lips. "Ready for the big day?" Emily smiled, sitting up in bed. "I can hardly believe we've made it this far," she replied, picking up a cup of coffee. The big day Richard referred to was the inauguration of the Foundation's first Social Innovation Center, a space dedicated to incubating startups and projects focused on ethical solutions for social and business problems. As they got ready, the couple reflected on the journey of the last few years. The investigations had resulted in a series of convictions and plea bargains that shook the structures of power in the country. George Anderson and Richard's father, after serving reduced sentences due to their cooperation, now worked on rehabilitation projects for ex-inmates. Helen, in turn, surprised everyone by becoming one of the main voices in the fight for reforms in the business system. Her whistleblower support organization had grown exponentially, offering legal and psychological support to people who decided to report unethical practices in their companies. Victoria Carpenter, sentenced to a long prison term, spent her days cooperating with international investigations, unraveling a global web of corruption that went far beyond the borders of the United States. On the way to the inauguration event, Emily and Richard passed by the old Anderson mansion. now transformed into a cultural and educational center. "It's still strange to see the house like this," Emily commented, a touch of nostalgia in her voice. Richard gently squeezed her hand. "But it's a good kind of strange, isn't it? Seeing something that symbolized so much secrecy and pain transform into a place of learning and growth." Emily nodded, smiling. "You're right. It's a beautiful metamorphosis." When they arrived at the Social Innovation Center, they were greeted by an enthusiastic crowd. Young entrepreneurs, activists, journalists, and even some reformist politicians crowded around, eager to see the result of 2 years of hard work and dedication. Among the faces in the crowd, Emily spotted Olivia. Their friendship, though shaken by past events, had been slowly rebuilt over time. Olivia now led a financial education project for underprivileged communities, using her experience to help others avoid the pitfalls she herself had faced. Next to Olivia was Alex, who in recent years had dedicated himself to working with at-risk youth, using his story as an example of redemption and change. When Emily and Richard took the stage for the opening speech, silence fell over the crowd. The respect and admiration they had earned was evident, not for their name or fortune, but for their actions and commitment to change. 2 years ago, Emily began, her voice firm and full of emotion, "We stood before you promising to transform the pain of our past into hope for the future. It's a symbol that it's possible to do business ethically, that it's possible to create wealth without compromising values, that it's possible to transform challenges into opportunities for growth and positive change." As they spoke about the projects that would be incubated there, about partnerships with universities and international organizations, the feeling of hope and possibility that permeated the environment was palpable. "Today we're here to show that this promise wasn't in vain," Richard continued. "This Social Innovation Center is more than just a building." After the speech, as they walked among the stands of the selected projects, Emily and Richard were approached by a young entrepreneur, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "You have no idea how much your stories and actions have inspired us," she said. "You showed that it's possible to confront past mistakes and use that experience to create something truly transformative." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, moved. "But the real inspiration comes from people like you, who choose to use your creativity and passion to make a difference." At the end of the day, exhausted but deeply satisfied, Emily and Richard returned to their beach house. Sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, they reflected on how far they had come. "If someone had told me 3 years ago that we would be here today living this life, doing this work," Richard commented, "I would have thought it impossible." Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "It's amazing how things change, isn't it? How from the ashes of all that, we managed to build something so meaningful. And to think it all started with a runaway bride," Richard joked, eliciting a laugh from Emily. "Speaking of which," said Emily, turning to face him, "what do you think about finally making it official? No pomp, no circumstance, just us two here on this beach, with the people who really matter." Richard's eyes lit up. "Are you sure?" Emily smiled, a smile full of love and certainty. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." The dawn on the beach brought with it an atmosphere of expectation and serenity. Emily woke up early, her heart racing with the prospect of the day ahead. Today, she and Richard would finally make their union official, not with the pomp and circumstance they once imagined, but with the simplicity and authenticity that now defined their lives. As she prepared, Emily reflected on the journey that brought them here, the painful revelations, the reconstruction of their lives and identities, the hard work to transform their family's legacy into something positive. All of this had strengthened them, both individually and as a couple. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Helen, her mother, who entered the room with teary eyes. "Oh, my daughter," said Helen, her voice choked with emotion. "You look beautiful." Emily smiled, feeling a wave of affection for her mother. In recent years, they had rebuilt their relationship on more solid foundations of honesty and mutual respect. "Thank you, Mum," Emily replied, embracing Helen. "I'm happy you're here." Helen held her daughter's hands, her gaze intense. "Emily, I know I wasn't the mother you deserved for a long time, but I want you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become. You and Richard, you've transformed a tragedy into something beautiful and meaningful." The words touched Emily deeply. "Mum, we all make mistakes. What's important is how we choose to move forward. Outside, the beach had been decorated with simplicity and elegance. A small altar made of driftwood and wildflowers awaited the couple. White chairs arranged on the sand accommodated a select group of guests, only the closest and most important people in their lives. Richard waited at the altar, elegant in a light suit appropriate for the beach occasion. At his side, Alex smiled, proud to be the best man. In the front rows, George and Richard's father sat side by side, their faces a mixture of regret and hope for the future. Olivia, now reconciled with Emily and serving as her maid of honor, gave the final touches to her friend's dress before taking her place. When the soft music began to play, all eyes turned to Emily, who walked along the sand arm in arm with Frank, or rather, Agent Mirel. The ex-agent, now a close friend and mentor, had become a father figure for Emily over the years. Upon reaching the altar, Emily and Richard exchanged looks full of love and promise. The officiant, a friend they had made through the foundation's work, began the ceremony with words about renewal, forgiveness, and the transformative power of love. Emily and Richard, he said, you have arrived at this moment not by the path you expected, but through a journey that tested and strengthened your love. Today, you choose each other not out of expectations or obligations, but through a conscious and profound decision. The vows they exchanged were simple, but loaded with meaning. They spoke about overcoming adversities together, about the commitment not just to each other, but to the values that now guided their lives. Richard, said Emily, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, you taught me that true love isn't just about the happy moments, but about facing storms side by side. I promise to be your partner in all the challenges life brings us, and to celebrate every victory, no matter how small, with you. Richard, with tears in his eyes, replied, Emily, you showed me what it means to have true courage to face the truth no matter how painful, and to rebuild something beautiful from the ashes. I promise to be by your side in every step of this ongoing journey of growth and transformation. When they were finally declared husband and wife, the small assembly erupted in applause and tears of joy. The kiss that sealed their union was more than a romantic gesture. It was a symbol of renewed commitment, not just to each other, but to the ideals that now defined their lives. The reception that followed was an intimate and joyful celebration. Simple tables had been arranged on the sand, decorated with lanterns and local flowers. The food, prepared by a social gastronomy project supported by the foundation, was a feast of American flavors. During the party, George asked for a word. With a choked voice, he addressed not just the newlyweds, but everyone present. A few years ago, I was on top of the world, or so I thought. I had power, money, influence. But today, seeing my daughter so radiant, so truly happy and fulfilled, I realize that only now do I understand what really matters. Emily, Richard, you've taught us a valuable lesson about integrity, forgiveness, and the power of starting over. Thank you for giving us this second chance. George's words touched everyone deeply, symbolizing the journey of redemption that not just he, but many present had undergone. As the night progressed, Emily and Richard found a moment to escape for a walk by the sea. Under the starry sky, they reflected on the path that brought them here. If someone had told me 3 years ago that we would be here today, living this life, doing this work, Richard commented, echoing a conversation they had in the past, I would still think it impossible. Emily smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. And yet, here we are. It's amazing how things unfolded, isn't it? You know what's more amazing? Richard asked, pulling her closer. That amid all the chaos, all the revelations and changes, one thing remained constant. What I feel for you. Emily felt her heart fill with love and gratitude. Our love was tested in every possible way, and here we are, stronger than ever. They stopped, looking at the horizon where the sky met the sea. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities and challenges. But now, united not just by love, but by a shared purpose, they felt ready to face anything life presented them. To our future, said Richard, symbolically raising an imaginary glass. To a future of truth, integrity, and love, Emily completed. Sealing the promise with a kiss, Emily and Richard walked back to the party, ready to begin the next chapter of their lives. A chapter that they knew would be written not just for them, but for all those whose lives they would touch through their work and example. The night of celebration continued, full of laughter, dances, and meaningful conversations. It was more than a wedding party. It was a celebration of renewal, of second chances, and of the transformative power of true love. 5 years had passed since Emily and Richard's beach wedding. Time brought not only personal growth for the couple, but also a significant expansion of their work and influence. On an autumn morning, Emily woke to the soft sound of children's laughter coming from downstairs. Smiling, she stretched and went down the stairs to find Richard playing with their 3-year-old daughter, Sophie, and their 1-year-old son, Lucas. "Good morning, my loves," said Emily, joining the play on the living room rug. Richard greeted her with an affectionate kiss. "Good morning. Ready for the big day?" Emily nodded, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness in her eyes. Today was the inauguration day of the first university campus of the Anderson Moore Foundation, an ambitious project aimed at revolutionizing education in business ethics and social responsibility in the United States. As they prepared to leave, Emily reflected on how their lives had changed. The beach house, once a refuge, was now their permanent home. The simplicity and connection with nature had become an integral part of who they were, and the values they wanted to pass on to their children. On the way to the inauguration ceremony, they passed by the old Anderson mansion, now a thriving cultural center. Seeing the place of her childhood transformed into a space for learning and growth always filled Emily with a mixture of emotions. When they arrived at the campus, they were greeted by an enthusiastic crowd. Students, professors, journalists, and prominent figures from the business and academic world crowded around, eager to witness the beginning of a new era in American education. Among the faces in the crowd, Emily spotted her parents. Helen, now a respected speaker on corporate ethics, smiled proudly. George, who after serving his sentence had dedicated himself to working with rehabilitation of ex-inmates, waved discreetly. Olivia and Alex, now married and expecting their first child, were also present. Both had become important figures in the foundation, leading financial education initiatives and mentoring young entrepreneurs. When Emily and Richard took the stage for the opening speech, a respectful silence fell over the crowd. 8 years ago, Emily began, her voice firm and emotional, we were at a crossroads. We could have chosen the easy path, ignoring the painful truths that came to light. But we chose to face our history, as difficult as it was, and transform it into something positive. Richard continued, this campus is more than just a set of buildings. It's a symbol of renewal, of second chances. Here we will train leaders who understand that true success is not measured just by numbers on a balance sheet, but by the positive impact we can have on the world. As they detailed the innovative programs that would be offered, from applied ethics in artificial intelligence to sustainable business models for underprivileged communities, the enthusiasm and hope that permeated the environment were evident. After the speech, as they walked through the campus interacting with students and professors, Emily and Richard were approached by a young reporter. "You've transformed a scandal story into a movement for positive change," she said admiringly. "How is it possible to maintain optimism and strength to continue, even in the face of constant challenges?" Emily smiled, exchanging a knowing look with Richard before answering, "The key is to remember that each challenge is an opportunity for growth. We're not seeking perfection but continuous progress. And having people by our side who share this vision makes everything possible." At the end of the day, exhausted but deeply satisfied, Emily and Richard returned home. They found Helen taking care of the children, a scene that still warmed their hearts. Seeing her mother, once distant and focused only on appearances, now so loving and present, was a constant reminder of the power of change and forgiveness. Later, with the children already in bed, the couple sat on the porch, watching the sea under the starry sky. "Sometimes I still wonder," Richard said thoughtfully, "if we're really making a difference. If all this work is really changing things." Emily squeezed his hand affectionately. "Look at our own lives, at the people around us. See how many transformation stories we've witnessed. It may be a slow process, but each life touched, each mind opened to new possibilities is a victory." Richard nodded, a smile forming on his lips. "You're right. And to think that it all started with a runaway bride and a groom left at the altar." Emily laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Life has mysterious ways, doesn't it? Who would have thought that day that seemed like the end of everything would actually be the beginning of something so significant? As the night progressed, Emily and Richard remained there, reflecting on the past and dreaming about the future. They knew that the path ahead would still be full of challenges. Changing deep-rooted mindsets, fighting against corrupt systems, inspiring a new generation to prioritize ethics and social responsibility. None of this would be easy. But there, under the stars, with the sound of the sea in the background and the warmth of each other, they felt ready to face any obstacle. Because they had learned that true love, coupled with a greater purpose, has the power to overcome any adversity and create a legacy that transcends generations. 10 years had passed since that fateful day when Emily ran away from her own wedding. A decade of transformations, challenges, and above all, growth. On this sunny spring morning, Emily and Richard were preparing for an event that would mark not only their lives, but potentially the future of the country. The Anderson Moore Foundation had become a driving force in promoting business ethics and social responsibility in the United States. Their university campus, inaugurated 5 years ago, was already training leaders who were changing the corporate landscape of the country. Now, they were about to launch their most ambitious initiative yet, a national mentoring and incubation program for socially and environmentally responsible startups. Sophie, now 8 years old, and Lucas, 6, ran excitedly around the house while their parents got ready. The children had grown up with a deep understanding of the importance of their parents' work, often accompanying them to events and community projects. "Mom," Sophie called, entering her parents' room, "can I wear Grandma Helen's necklace today?" Emily smiled, picking up the delicate pearl necklace her mother had given her. It was a symbol of the reconciliation and new bond they had built over the years. "Of course, my love. Grandma will be happy to see it on you." As she helped her daughter with the necklace, Emily reflected on how her relationship with Helen had blossomed. Her mother, once obsessed with status and appearances, was now a loving grandmother and a strong ally in the Foundation's mission. Richard entered the room, adjusting his tie. "Everyone ready? The helicopter will arrive in half an hour." The use of the helicopter was a rarity for them, reserved only for special occasions like this one. The decision to maintain a relatively simple life, away from the ostentatious luxury of their childhoods, had been crucial in keeping their values aligned with their mission. The family arrived at the event venue, an imposing convention center in New York, transformed for the occasion. Banners with the Foundation's motto, "Building an Ethical Future, One Business at a Time," decorated the lobby. As they entered, they were greeted by a wave of applause. Familiar and new faces mingled in the crowd. Olivia and Alex, now with 3 children, waved from a corner. George and Richard's father, both visibly aged but with a renewed gleam in their eyes, animatedly conversed with a group of young entrepreneurs. Helen, elegant as always, approached to hug her grandchildren. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered to Emily and Richard, emotion evident in her voice. The event began with an emotional video, narrating the Anderson Moore Foundation's journey from its turbulent origins to the present. Images of successful projects, transformed communities, and young leaders inspired by the Foundation's mission filled the screen. When Emily and Richard took the stage, the silence was palpable. The anticipation for the announcement of the new program was immense. 10 years ago, Emily began, her voice firm and charged with emotion, "we were at rock bottom. Our lives, which seemed perfect from the outside, had crumbled under the weight of secrets and lies." Richard continued, "But from that moment of crisis, an opportunity was born. An opportunity to redefine what success means, to show that it's possible to do business ethically and still prosper." Emily resumed, "Today, we're here to announce the next step in this journey. A program that will not only incubate ethical and sustainable startups, but will also connect them with experienced mentors and investors committed to positive impact." As they detailed the program, the growing enthusiasm in the audience was evident. The plan was ambitious. In the next 5 years, they aim to incubate more than 1,000 startups across the United States, focusing especially on underprivileged regions and entrepreneurs from underrepresented groups. "But this program is more than just about business," Richard emphasized. "It's about changing the mindset of an entire generation. It's about showing that true success comes when we align our business goals with the well-being of society and the planet." After the official announcement, the event transformed into a celebration. Entrepreneurs, investors, and community leaders mingled, exchanging ideas and forming connections. The air was charged with hope and possibilities. In a quiet moment, Emily and Richard found themselves in a tranquil corner, observing the scene before them. "Did you imagine we would come this far?" Richard asked, embracing Emily from behind. She leaned back against him, smiling. "Honestly? No. But I'm so grateful that we're here together, making a difference." At that moment, they were interrupted by a young entrepreneur, her eyes shining with emotion. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson Moore, I just wanted to say, you changed my life. I grew up in a community where business ethics was seen as weakness, but you showed that it's possible to be successful and do good. My renewable energy project for low-income communities, it exists because of you." The young woman's words touched Emily and Richard deeply. It was a powerful reminder of the impact their choices and actions could have. At the end of the day, back at their beach house, the family gathered on the porch. The sound of the waves and the sunset created an atmosphere of peace and reflection. Sophie, curious as always, asked, "Mom, Dad, do you think one day we won't need the foundation anymore? That everyone will be ethical in business?" Emily and Richard exchanged glances, pondering how to respond. "Sweetheart," Emily began, "the work of building a better world never really ends. But every step we take in that direction is important," Richard complimented. "The important thing is to never stop trying, to never stop believing that we can make a difference, even when it seems difficult." As the children played in the sand and the sky tinged with shades of orange and pink, Emily and Richard reflected on their journey. From the ashes of a scandal, they had built not just a new life for themselves, but a legacy of hope and transformation for countless others. The future, as always, was uncertain. New challenges would arise, old problems would persist. But there, on that beach, with their children laughing in the background and the warmth of each other, Emily and Richard felt prepared to face anything, because they had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true love coupled with a greater purpose has the power to overcome any obstacle and create waves of change that extend far beyond our own lives. And so, as the sun set on the horizon, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, Emily and Richard silently renewed their commitment to each other and to the world they were helping to build, a more ethical, fairer, and more hopeful world for all.